Good Saturday morning to you. I'm Zanilo Evangelista, and welcome to our weekly discussion. This week, we're going to talk about specifically La Nina and just how much of a strong La Nina will impact this hurricane season. We're going to do a deep dive into past years that had pretty potent La Ninas, or at least some years that were significant overall in the past. But all these years I'm going to look at had La Ninas, and we're going to see just how they impacted the hurricane season. We're going to look at how the overall activity was, and also the impact aspect of it too. Where did these storms occur? Some questions, hopefully, that maybe we could answer, at least get a better idea of when it comes to this upcoming hurricane season. Hopefully we can answer them. And of course, as always, glad to have you along. Let's get started right away with the countdown till June 1st. It continues, obviously, every single day. We continue to get one day closer to the start of the hurricane season. And we're now 70 days away from that. And very soon, hurricane season will be right upon us, and we'll be in June, and it's already the end of March. Soon we'll be getting into next month when all the actual predictions start coming out. So that definitely should tell you time is coming, and it's definitely fast approaching at this point now. All right, so in order to kind of properly deep dive La Nina, I have what is the Climate Prediction Center. This is the Oceanic Nino Index from the Climate Prediction Center. And basically, this is a mapping, kind of like a graphic, a table that shows all historical El Nino and La Nina episodes basically since the 1950s. And so we're really going to do a deep dive, and I'm really trying to show all the years in the past that had strong La Ninas. And we're going to start from the beginning. As you can see at the top of the table, first year, we had some pretty significant Nina events. We had 1950, we had a dying Nina, and then came 1954, there was a La Nina. But the first really strong La Nina that's on this table is 1955, and we notice the value of the La Nina, the Oceanic Nino Index, peaked at negative 1.7, and that is strong La Nina territory. And so, with that being said, how did 1955 play out? Well, this is 1955 right here. One most important thing that I really like to look at is what activity we had in the Western Atlantic, especially the Caribbean and the United States. And you notice the Caribbean was very active that year. We had several pretty big storms for the Carolinas, and I think a total of four names were retired. And by the way, about the retirements, no retirements this year from the Atlantic, and of course we had two in the Pacific. Actually, the first time in 9 years since we've had no retirements in the Atlantic, 9 or 10 years, I'm not sure, but the Atlantic went retirement free this year. Very much different from 1955, which had four retirements. One you could obviously see is from the Caribbean, and that's also another thing to keep in mind. 1955 had a very active Caribbean, lots of U.S. impacts. It seems like 1955 was a pretty active overall year, and that was one of the instances that we had a strong La Nina. And then after that, you have to go basically, what is it, 9, 10 years into the mid 1960s, till we had another La Nina event, and it wasn't even that much of a strong one, but it was the first La Nina after that in many years. So I'm going to bring that up next. 1964. That year too was also very active. This was actually one of the most active years for Florida in terms of hurricane impacts. Besides 2004, you could very clearly see that. And there was also another major hurricane landfall in the Caribbean. There was a landfall in Haiti that was bad. Don't know this name of the storm, but I think it might be Gladys or something. Actually, I'm not sure. So I'm not really going to try to guess. But there were a total of three hurricane landfalls in Florida that year. One of them you could obviously see. If you're not familiar with it, Hurricane Dora hit Jacksonville and northern Florida. And then we also had a pretty significant landfall in Louisiana. And the Gulf was also active that year too. And that's something else to keep in mind when looking at these years. And we're going to look at a bunch more of them soon. But now, since we're entering away from the 1950s and 60s, which was widely considered the last active period in the Atlantic, now we're going to switch phases. Of course, that being the AMO, we're going to go from the warm phase If those, I always talk about the AMO being the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, kind of like the cycle that kind of lasts every 20 to 30 years, in which the Atlantic goes from warm, like you see in this map that I'm showing here, to cold, where the Atlantic is, instead of warm, it's a lot colder than average. And because of that, we have an extended period of activity that is much less active. And of course, activity is very displaced, because you could see all the warmer water in these active areas. In the positive AMO, all the warmer water is in the deep tropics, which is why we have a lot of Caribbean, Gulf, and even sometimes United States activity. While in the colder AMO, the deep tropics is a lot colder, and we see a lot more subtropical activity, and that's definitely a trend that you'll see from the few um years that I do show in this era that we're about to enter, which is from 1970s into the mid 1990s, when the Atlantic gets a lot colder. And you can see it starting off with 1970. You could already see this was the last year. Let's really quickly go back just to prove that this was actually a La Nina year. 1970 was actually a pretty decent La Nina, peaked at negative 1.4, and then kind of was a La Nina that lasted into the next year, into 1971. But 1970, you could see the start of the activity beginning to wind down. Lots of less activity in the deep tropics, especially strong storms, but we still had pretty decent Caribbean activity. We had a few storms in the Eastern Caribbean, few storms in the Western Caribbean, and they seemed to get stronger as they went into the Gulf. I see two Category 3 plots, so there were probably some intense storms in the Gulf that year. So even though we were starting to get to kind of wind down from the active period in the Atlantic, we still did have some pretty decent storms, and the overall season definitely was a little more active, obviously enhanced by the La Nina. But as you can see, as we get more entrenched into this inactive period, you can see even active years. The next year here is 1984. Let's go to 1984 to show how active that was, or how much of a La Nina we had. And that year was also a pretty decent Nina too. Didn't show 1983 because, well, that was a really dead year. There was really nothing that happened in 1983. In fact, that year only had four named storms, I think. Again, a hallmark of the fact that we were in a really inactive era. But 1984 was a lot more active. Had a pretty potent Nina that year too. And this year was actually pretty active, despite, of course, it being in an inactive era. I think 1984 actually had 13 named storms, which now we look at it and that's kind of like only an average season. But back then, relative to what was happening at that time, 13 storms is quite a lot. And you could see, obviously, because we were in an inactive era, a lot more activity focused in the subtropics, but we still did get a few impacts here and there. I think this is Hurricane Diane, which did kind of stall off the coast of the Carolinas before moving in as a hurricane. So there were still impacts. But then, of course, we move on to the next years into this active period. And this is by the time we're now in the late 80s, early 90s, when we start getting out of this active period and we start seeing more of the Atlantic beginning to ramp up. 1988, I'll show you that year too. That's the next potent Nina after 1984. And that was a very strong La Nina, as strong as negative 1.8. And 1988 is some of the years that I sometimes see people throw around. And honestly, I think it's a pretty good year to look at too, despite, of course, it being in the inactive era. Very strong La Nina that year. And what did that give us? Look at that. Lots of Caribbean activity. Hurricane Gilbert, the second strongest hurricane on record in the Atlantic, happened in 1988. And we also had Hurricane Joanne, which was a crossover storm from the Atlantic into the Eastern Pacific. But most importantly, we had Gilbert and Joanne, two major hurricanes in the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic, and we also had a recurve strong major hurricane too. So another active year that was La Nina, and we had quite a bit of Western Atlantic impacts. After that, the next year we go to, after 1988, we go another year, that another kind of time period, that we go from La Nina to just a whole bunch of years of neutral and maybe some El Nino. And then we land ourselves in 1995, and that's when we begin to flip back from cold to warm. And so 1995 is widely regarded as the first year that was the start of the current active era that we're in. You probably might have heard it a lot, but 1995 was this pivotal year that we saw the Atlantic go from inactive to suddenly it was very active, and that year had 19 storms, and you could just look at it. 1995 is one of those, especially when it comes to metrics of calculating how much energy, the accumulated cyclone energy that year we had something over 200. It was 1995 is definitely one of those top years that we look at in terms of overall activity in the Atlantic. And I mean, it's just obvious. Just look at how active this year was. Lots of deep tropical activity, especially in the MDR. Not that much Caribbean stuff, but we did have quite a few Gulf storms. There was, you can see this major hurricane here, Hurricane Opal, pretty significant storm for the Florida Panhandle. And then we also had Hurricane Erin, which is also another storm for the Panhandle as well. And then we also had Hurricane Luis, which I kind of like to consider the Irma before Irma happened, because obviously that was the last benchmark storm, if you will, for portions of the Northern Islands. And we had multiple long tracked high ACE producing storms in 1995 that year. And that was another La Nina year. Lots of deep tropical activity, and the deep tropics were heavily favored. After that, we started having La Ninas a lot more often, or at least it wasn't long before we had another very strong Nina. And before that, we've had 1988 and 1998 and 1999. And those years as well were also very significant. And those are actually some of the years that a lot of people are using as potential analogs to this year. And 1998, what do you notice? Lots of activity, long tracked activity too from the MDR into the Caribbean. We also had, this was Hurricane George, and then we also had Hurricane Bonnie, and then I was going to point to this one. This is Hurricane Mitch, and Mitch to this date is the most deadliest storm for a single count in terms of deaths in a single storm to date since it happened. We've not had a storm worse than that, at least in the modern era. There have been a few storms all the way in the past that have been much worse than Mitch, but those were all before the satellite era, or most of them are before the satellite era. You get what I mean. Mitch is the most impactful and deadliest storm in terms of modern statistics, in terms of deaths. And we had that year, and that was also a Caribbean late season Caribbean storm. A lot of these years, you'll notice, if you actually look at this data more, which I use Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is free. It gives you free data, free information that you could just search up and you can look at. Honestly, I do support Wikipedia. And if you look at a lot of these years, such as Mitch and some of the next years that we'll look at coming up, a lot of these years had some pretty bad late season Caribbean storms, and that also tends to be a theme in these La Ninas too. So keep that in mind. But 1998, there was an 88 and 98. 1998 was another very significant year for the Atlantic. We had 14 storms, and we also had a very much above normal ACE index. And then, of course, the very next year, 1999, was also another significant year too. We had lots of Western Atlantic activity. There was Hurricane Floyd, and then obviously you all know by now, Wrong Way Lenny, another significant late season Caribbean storm. Like I just mentioned, we have a lot of them. We tend to have quite a few of them in strong La Nina years. So we had Lenny, that was very significant in the Caribbean, and then there was also Hurricane Brett, which impacted Texas too, and actually impacted as a major hurricane, though it doesn't always get that much attention, I guess. Maybe it was not as much of an impactful storm to Texas despite it being a major hurricane. But of course, obviously, Brett is still in the naming list now and it's not retired, so maybe it wasn't as impactful, but it was still a major hurricane that happened, and generally kind of goes to show the idea that in these sort of La Nina years, we tend to get a lot more activity in the Western Atlantic favored. And then after that, we go to the next year that we had a more significant La Nina. We had 2000, 2000, which was also a kind of a continuation, because from 1998 to 2000 was kind of this very long, lasting La Nina. A lot like what we had just recently from 2020 all the way up until early last year when we had a pretty long lasting La Nina. After that, we got out of that in 2001. And then the next La Nina after that, which was a weak one. And a lot of people tend to say that 2005, yes, we're talking about 2005 now, 2005 was a neutral year throughout most of the hurricane season, but I'm honestly interested in it because 2005, despite it being a neutral, it did really behave a lot like a La Nina atmospherically. And because of that, we also had obviously no explanation for 2005. Obviously, Caribbean very active, Gulf of Mexico very destructive. We had multiple really intense hurricanes in the Gulf. We had Katrina, there was Rita, and then obviously, as I was pointing to earlier on, late season, very strong Caribbean storm, which was Wilma. And obviously, Hurricane Wilma is to date the most destructive storm. Not destructive, I meant the most intense storm, at least by barometric pressure in the Atlantic, to date still. So kind of just goes to show the kind of pattern we see in La Nina. And then obviously 2005 as well had Dennis and Emily, which happened in the early season in July. So that really just goes to show the favorable conditions we had. And obviously it's in response to the atmosphere responding more of like a La Nina in 2005, even though it really wasn't there until much later on in the year, almost till before the season, almost till when the season ended. That it's not till when we actually got a La Nina in place, but La Nina was still there, even if it was, I guess, kind of just there in spirit, if you know what I mean. But other than that, kind of just goes to show the same idea. 2005 was really active, obviously very impactful for the Western Atlantic. What was the next La Nina after that? 2007. And I know 2007, if we look at that year, kind of looks dull, but if you look closer, you can see the Caribbean and notice very dull year, but then all of a sudden we have two category fives. This was Hurricane Dean and Felix in 2007, both very devastating storms for the Caribbean. Dean was very strong for the Yucatan, and then Felix was very, very bad for Central America. And that year was a La Nina. And that year had some sort of issues atmospherically, kind of like what 2013 experienced, but La Nina was obviously there, strong enough that it kind of still had an influence, I guess, if you will. And we still had storms like Hurricane Dean and Hurricane Felix, which obviously were very impactful for the Caribbean. And you could kind of say, even into 2007, the kind of theme of very active activity in the Western Atlantic continues. After that, 2008, and 2008 was a lot much of a weaker Nina in compared to 2007. But if you look at 2008, you could definitely tell it was still La Nina. Longer track storms again. There was Hurricane Ike, and then there was also Hurricane Gustav, and there was storms like Paloma too. Very impactful for the Caribbean. Cuba got a lot of hits. They got Ike, they got Gustav, they got Paloma. I think a total of three major hurricane hits in Cuba in 2008, and then obviously we had our impacts to the Gulf Coast as well. And then there was also Hurricane Omar. Two actually late season strong major hurricanes. There was Paloma and then there was Omar, which I guess kind of goes to continue the trend that we kind of see in these years, that we get a lot of activity and particularly strong activity too in the late season as well. And that continues into our next year, 2010. 2010, obviously, probably one of the top analogs, I should say, honestly, for this year. And we saw a very strong Nino that year. Negative 1.6 is what the Oceanic Nino Index topped out at, negative 1.6, and it was also long lasting too. And we saw 2010, very active season overall. And yes, while it was not quite as active for the United States, we only had one storm that impacted. I know, very crazy for a year, especially like 2010. That's kind of like, I guess you could say, kind of like what 2010 is known for, being not as active of a year for the United States, but still a very active year overall, and actually pretty impactful for Mexico and the Caribbean too. You could see we had our fair share of Caribbean activity that year too, as well as lots of long tracked deep tropics MDR stuff as well. We had Hurricane Earl impacted the Northern Islands, and this is Hurricane Tomas that I'm pointing at right now. This was also another late season Caribbean storm. Kind of just continues to show that the trend continues in these years that we tend to have these late season Caribbean activity. And also, in 2010 too. Tomas was not the only one. There was also, I think there was Hurricane Sherry, and then there was Richard and Sherry. There was a whole lot of storms that happened in 2010 in the Caribbean in the late season, and then in the Gulf. You can see in the Bay of Campeche. This wasn't quite the late season, but this was Hurricane Carl. Very impactful storm actually for Mexico. Caused quite a bit of deaths. Honestly, should have been retired if you look at some of the statistics, but it wasn't. But it was still statistically very impactful for Mexico, and kind of just continues to show that 2010 too was honestly pretty impactful for the Western Atlantic, even though the United States didn't get a lot of the activity. And we also had our fair share of activity too for portions of Canada as well. There was Hurricane Earl, and then this here was Hurricane Igor, which impacted Newfoundland, and I think that's where Igor got its retirement from. So definitely a pretty impactful storm too. And of course, this was a strong La Nina. And then finally, we get to the last few years, the more later years, the more modern years, and especially some of these years, the more known years, especially in the hurricane tracking community. The years that we kind of are thinking of now, especially when it comes to the benchmark for activity. At least we're looking at them as benchmarks for this season, 2017, the first one. And there was a La Nina in 2011. That year kind of though was, I guess you could say, somewhat more or less the same, kind of like the general idea you could get from 2010, although there was Hurricane Irene in 2011. But then after that, there was also 2016. This was also kind of a, you could say it was kind of a really weak La Nina. It almost wasn't a La Nina at all, but we still had storms like Hurricane Matthew, which that too was late season as well. And there was also some other stuff too, which was significant in the late season and in the Caribbean too. But most significantly, 2017, that was another really bad year. I mean, we all know 2017 right by now. At this point, really bad year for the Caribbean, and for the Northern Islands, especially a really bad year for Puerto Rico and also Texas too. We got Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma in Florida as well. Definitely a very bad year for the Western Atlantic, and also multiple long track storms too. I mean, September, actually the most amount of ACE in a single month for a basin across the globe was 2017. We got multiple really long tracked, very high ACE producing storms that month in September, and overall a very active year. Kind of what you would expect, of course, in a developing La Nina as well, which we saw in 2017, and it wasn't a super significant Nina, but we still had a lot of activity too. And finally, our year that we're finally getting to kind of wrap up this deep dive, if you will, we get to 2020. And you could obviously see it here, 2020. Obviously, just like 2005, no explanation needed. Very active year for the Atlantic as a whole. 30 named storms that year. Very significant of a season, not only for its amount of activity, but also the impact to record amount of landfalls in a single year for the United States. Really active Caribbean, really active Gulf. Lots of impacts, especially to Louisiana, Hurricane Laura. And then the late season, I mean, we keep on saying the late season, but the late season, we all remember the late season, how that year was. We had 5 major hurricanes total that year in the late season. Especially most notably in the Caribbean, we had storms like Hurricane Delta, we had Eta and Iota, very impactful for Central America, especially it being in November too. Very significant year. And if we look at 2020, that year actually did have quite a decent Nina as well, peaked at negative 1.3 on the Oceanic Nino index, if you will. And then we also had the significant years after that. We had 2021 and 2022, which also did kind of continue the sort of trend of impactful storms in the Western Atlantic. Even 2022, even though it wasn't as active as a year in terms of overall activity, we still had storms like Fiona and even Ian in the Caribbean too. 2022 was significant. So with that being said, we look at all these years, we go back to all these years, and you can see the general trend for activity in the Caribbean, and especially in all of these years that were very potent Niñas. You can see the activity trends continue. Very active Caribbean, obviously, even in years kind of like 1970, or even, you could even look back at to the years like the 1950s. Very active year, very active patterns indeed in the Western Atlantic and in the Caribbean, and also the deep tropics too. Kind of just goes to show. I got a notification, but we're going to continue. Kind of just goes to show how La Nina tends to favor activity in the Atlantic. We tend to see that focus of energy in the deep tropics, and that opens the door for storms to form in the MDR, track into the Caribbean, or even form in the Caribbean, and cause a lot of impact too, because they're in the Western Atlantic. They're already in our sort of hemisphere, our kind of sort of borders of the world that we're in. And so they're right on our doorstep. I should have actually said this. They're right on our doorstep, and therefore they obviously are very much vulnerable to bringing a lot of impacts, which is why we look at La Niñas very closely, especially if they tend to be on the stronger side. And how does that fare out for this season? Well, just kind of just going already. This is the mid-March predictions by the CPC, and of course, the probability for La Nina is very high, especially by the time we get to the hurricane season. By the peak season, we're basically already at a 70% chance for La Nina. In March, we already have the confidence that we're going to be 70% possibility that will be in a La Nina by the time we get to the peak of the hurricane season. And how does that look like for actual intensity? Well, you can see here, this is the CFS, and the CFS takes us, as I've been mentioning, potent La Ninas. Those are really years that we've been looking at throughout the whole entirety of our deep dive that we've done. And look at how strong the CFS makes this La Nina. In terms of tri-monthly periods, the CFS brings this La Nina strength all the way down to -2. Very significant La Nina indeed, and definitely rings alarm bells, especially when you put all this together and you look at what the models are showing in terms of what the actual pattern is. And of course, here's the C3S kind of showing that very pattern, and here you can see it. Kind of just lines up with everything we've been talking about. Very active deep tropics, very active Caribbean, and you could also kind of look at it as if it's trying to detect tracks that we could see in the season. You could see coming from the MDR all the way into the Caribbean, and that obviously lines up exactly with what we've been showing, especially with what occurs in these very active La Nina years. And how does that kind of shape up as to what we have so far this season, so far right now in real time? Very warm Atlantic. This is today. This is the NOAA Coral Reef Watch updated. Not updated yet. Let me see if I could actually refresh it and if it'll update. Yeah, there we go. Updated as of yesterday. So we kind of have, I guess you could say, the most updated map from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch so far. Very warm Atlantic, the case that's been throughout the entire winter, and all the climate models expect this to continue right into the season. Very warm Caribbean too, and as opposed to our El Nino that we have right now, well, you could definitely see it's definitely beginning to chip away, and all of the models expect, as I showed. I only show the CFS here, but all of them, if you look at all the climate models, they all are in agreement that we will be in La Nina, or at least in a much cooler ENSO by the time we get to the hurricane season. So really, the takeaway that you could get from this video is La Nina. How does it impact the season? Well, it definitely increases activity, especially in the deep tropics, and even in key areas that we look at when it comes to impacts. So at least if you want to get a broader idea of how this hurricane season could be, it's definitely shaping up to be an interesting one for sure, and we'll definitely continue to monitor it over the next coming weeks. But that's going to wrap it up for this video, though. If you like what you saw, I really encourage you to like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you think, honestly. Share your opinions if you want to share your predictions, or if you just want to give feedback on my videos. I would really appreciate all sort of comments, except, of course, extraneous ones as well. Extraneous comments. And if you know if that pertains to you, and if you're watching and you know that pertains to you, definitely keep off with those extraneous comments. I'm watching those comments, and I will, of course, make sure that, of course, we're very civil. And I definitely encourage that from everybody. If we're going to have debates, if we're going to talk about the season, definitely keep it civil and definitely have, um, how do I say it, knowledgeable conversations. But as always, thanks for watching. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to all, obviously. Stay warm too if you're especially dealing with bad weather. There's definitely some bad weather occurring, especially where I am in the Northeast. Lots of rain, and also some areas getting lots of snow too in spring. Very crazy how our weather has been, and it definitely seems like it'll only get crazier from this point on. But thanks for watching. Stay safe, and we will talk again soon.